want to express our thanks and appreciation for the honor of this day and the opportunity to address you.
Over the years, we have lived lives of mutual accompaniment and have been blessed by our children, grandchildren, one great-grandchild, and many, many friends. We admit that there have been many times when we have failed to adequately meet the challenges that faced us.
We would like to acknowledge a few of those who have impacted our lives over the years, and some of the lessons learned along the way. First of all, our parents who sustained and supported us through difficult economic times.
They helped to ground us in a critical appreciation of the church.
Phil and Elizabeth Husby, who challenged me in grade 11 to participate in a speaking contest and mentored me through a life-changing process.
As I approached ordination, I became increasingly concerned about the alienation of working-class people from the church. Inspired by the French worker-priest movement, I got a leave of absence and worked for 2 years in a logging camp, holding church services on the weekends. Later, while ministering to a congregation, I worked in a pulp mill and served as recording secretary of the union.
Vince Goring of the Student Christian Movement encouraged me to attend a Christmas conference where Jim and I first met. Vince later asked us to change our wedding date so we could spend our honeymoon as co-directors of a student and industry work camp living with 18 university students age 18 to 25 in a downtown Toronto church. We were advised to give our marriage a 1-year trial period before getting a divorce.
In September 1959, we went to Kitimat Village to live with the Haisla people on the northwest coast of British Columbia. Neither of us had any previous experience with First Nations communities or people.
We came face to face with an entirely new culture, new language, and new ways of seeing the world. Here we began to learn that we are all related to all of nature.
Until the 1950s, Kitimat had been one of British Columbia's most isolated communities. Suddenly, right next to it, from the Montreal headquarters of the Aluminum Company of Canada, they plunked down a smelter and a modern community with several thousand people. Although there were benefits in terms of education, health, shopping, and employment, this also put great strain upon traditional social and economic structures.
The high-powered power line that crossed Haisla land did not provide power to the village, which continued to use a small diesel plant with power till 10:30 at night, from dusk till 10:30 at night. Raw sewage from the Kitimat town site, dumped into the river untreated, killed the Ulukan fishing, on which the Haisla were dependent.
We learned about the painful reality of racism, racial profiling, and discrimination in the courts.
We are indebted to the Haisla people, especially the children, women, young people, elders, and many others who welcomed and accepted us. Angeline Wilson, who made me feel that I was an adopted member of her family. Ella Grant, whose quiet and powerful dignity touched us deeply. And Ernie Grant, who gave me a name from the Raven clan. Of all the places in which we have lived, this is the one to which we continue to be connected.
60 years earlier, most of the Haisla people converted to Christianity. Leonardo Boff, a Brazilian theologian, has said, evangelization must respect the inalienable right of all persons to know, praise, and serve the God of history with the instruments of their own culture and the symbols of their own traditions.
Unfortunately, this is not the way that most missionaries worked. Certainly not our Methodist forebears. When a group of the Snuneymuxw First Nation promised Thomas Crosby that they would follow Christian teachings if they could continue their traditional dancing,
Crosby replied, "No, I cannot have anything to do with the old way, the dance, the potlatch. It's all bad."
Residential schools were another attempt to eliminate indigenous cultures, killing the Indian in the child.
The Truth and Reconciliation Report and our slow progress toward healing bear witness to the foolish, wrong-headed attempt to convert by clear-cutting cultures.
Beginning in the 1960s and 70s, feminism had a major impact on our lives. Learning to recognize each other as equals, trying to dig out the deeply rooted patriarchy from our language, our church, our society, and personal lives was much easier on a head level than on a gut level.
A workshop with Bishop Ted Scott and Kay Crow helped to enhance our communication skills in working together and in supporting each other's individual pursuits.
In 1975, I was invited to speak to BC Conference about International Women's Year. My talk introducing feminism, the women's movement, and inclusive language was followed by a request from Vicky Obedkoff that the language of the ordination service be made inclusive.
After this was agreed to, a small group of women spent many hours making pen and ink changes to all copies of the ordination service, ruining it for many people.
Later, I served on a General Council task force on sexism in the church, where we created guidelines for inclusive language. We also learned to be more accepting of people with different gender identities.
In the early 1980s, as a newly elected member of Parliament and the NDP critic for Indian Affairs, I was plunged into the debate over Canada's Constitution and privileged to play a part working with Indigenous and other members of Parliament to include recognition of existing Aboriginal and treaty rights.
We learned how difficult the decolonization process is. Changes in the Indian Act recognized the right of Indian bands to determine their own membership. At the same time, Canada removed discriminatory sections which took away the status of women who had married someone without status.
While many bands were glad to welcome back women who had married out, other bands developed membership regulations which did not allow for the re-entry of these women. So some women who had regained their Indian status were still excluded from living in their home communities. This conflict between individual and collective rights cannot be easily overcome. I'm
indebted to Max Dean, an art professor at Ottawa U, who challenged me to make my first video. To many women filmmakers of Latin America and the Caribbean, whose films were shown in a women's film festival in Mexico City. They inspired me to continue.
Eva was encouraged by Leonor Leon, a refugee who was subjected to extended police interrogation in Canada, to make A few questions.
Other docudramas and documentaries on social issues followed, including The Awakening of Elizabeth Shaw, a residential school story.
Years of sustained concern for First Nations issues extended to concern for justice and human rights for other peoples.
In our years of involvement with Central America, we were inspired by many people, among them Sheila Reid and Catherine Anderson, who work tirelessly for decades with Guatemalans.
GAM, the Group for Mutual Support of Families of the Disappeared in Guatemala.
Robert Fox and Richie Allen with Tools for Peace for Nicaragua. Sara Torres, who organized a visit with women in El Salvador, a video with them during the war, and election monitoring after the war.
Petrona and Francisco Garcia, Mayan refugees from Guatemala who've helped many children in San Pedro Necta to get an education. Pam
Cooley, who helped to organize project accompaniment, accompanying refugee returns to Guatemala from Mexico.
Marta Gloria de la Vega, a human rights lawyer in Guatemala who, under threat for her life, came to Canada with her family as a refugee and worked with the Christian Task Force on Central America to educate Canadians about the situation in Central America and to inspire us to action.
Lucio Martinez, a Mayan pastor under death threats in Guatemala, who said, "If we do not speak out, the very stones will cry out."
The persistence of the people in Central America and South America reminds us of their words, "Despair is a luxury we cannot afford."
On the home front, we were involved in the residential school issue. Hoping to give support to survivors, we were present each day during the 5-week trial. A trial against Canada, the United Church of Canada, and former supervisors.
Listening to the lawyer for the United Church drilling former students who had been abused was a gut-wrenching experience for everyone. But we were inspired by the courage of survivors like Willie Blackwater, who dug into their dark childhood and brought to light the stories of residential school abuse.
Over the years, there was one human rights issue that we avoided, fearing the loss of friendships and the accusations of anti-Semitism, was the desperate situation of Palestinians under Israeli occupation. We remained silent. Finally, we felt compelled to act, inspired by Palestinians and by Jewish Israelis who work for justice.
We participated in a pilgrimage of solidarity to Palestine, Israel, took part in attempts to send ships to Gaza, along with Ahab Lotayef and others, hoping to break the blockade, and we shared in local and national events and protests.
The Palestinian people continue to cry out for justice, and we have learned that silence implies consent.
In the refugee sponsorships, we continue to be inspired by Ashraf, a Palestinian who came to Nanaimo as a refugee, where he became a Canadian citizen and has taken an active role in welcoming every new refugee family who has come to our community.
Increasingly concerned with the impact of climate change on all species, we realize that we are engaged in major contradictions, such as air travel to Montreal to be with you. As graduates, you will face the challenge of ministering during a time of rapid climate change, high anxiety, and a need for drastic action.
A variant reading from Romans 8:28 says, "In everything, God works for good with those who love God." The divine creative spirit in which we live and move and have our being will remain with us no matter what happens. Our calling is to be open to the Spirit and to help others to be open also.
As we look back, we give thanks for all the opportunities that we have had.
Especially the privilege and blessing of working with each other, with family, and with friends.
Thank you.
And may you be blessed, all our relations.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous et un bon bonjour à Eric Ebert-Daly qui nous accompagne par les merveilles de l'Internet depuis Égypte. I've been charged with the almost impossible task of capturing in a few words the many accomplishments for which Jim and Eva Manly have been nominated. And there's really not much I can add to that magisterial presentation that they gave earlier. They have been nominated to receive the college's honorary doctorate. Pendant 60 ans, les Manly ont construit des ponts d'amour et de foi à travers le Canada et le monde. They have managed to keep their own marriage alive while doing important social justice work. They've gone about their respective artistic careers, Eva as a videographer and documentarist, and Jim as a writer, while working seemingly tirelessly as ministers of faith, activists, and parents. Jim was ordained in 1957. And though Eva herself was not formally ordained, they have ministered together since then. Theirs is an amazing United Church and Canadian story. No less a source than Wikipedia describes Jim as a clergyman, factory worker, and logger. As he told us himself, he was the NDP MP for Cowichan and Malahat, the Islands, from 1980 to 1988. And as far as Eva's videos are concerned, the ones that I saw that had a huge impact on me are A People Called to Speak, shot while accompanying, on the request of the United Church, Lucio Martinez, a Mayan Presbyterian pastor and human rights worker. And that video was followed by Bringing Truth to Light, shot while visiting Martinez's family after his death. But perhaps her best-known film is The Awakening of Elizabeth Shaw, which exposed the abuse and racism in a church-run institution for Indigenous children. On the day I reached Eva to request a few biographical details in preparation of the nomination, Eva was busy. She told me that they were accompanying a Syrian refugee that they're sponsoring. She went on and said, "I've been busy organizing musicians for weekly community coffee break and Sunday readers for St. Andrews. No time to chat. We're heading to Victoria for a 2-day symposium on the Site C Dam, and we're leaving shortly." When most people seek a life of retirement and ease, Jim and Eva have courageously expressed their solidarity with many groups, and as they talked about earlier, with the Palestinian people. In 2012, at the age of 78, Jim was arrested by Israel for trying to breach a blockade of the Gaza Strip on the humanitarian ship Estelle. He was released several days later, saying that he suffered only minor indignities. Pardon?
No belt.
Did you do the perp walk too, Jim? James Douglas Manly was born in Saskatoon in 1932. Eva Grace Jacobson Manly was born on a farm in Tilly, Alberta in 1938. They married each other in Tilly on May 9th, 1959, so tomorrow is indeed their 60th wedding anniversary. But stop, just wait. Their 4 children are all here: Seamus, Paul, Heather Ann, and Mark. Maybe they can just wave or something. And the 3 conjoints of their children, Celia, Sam, and Magdalena, as well as 3 of their grandchildren, Camilla, Avon, and Lucas. So it's been a great week for the The Manly family, not the least of the good news is that Paul Manly, who's here operating a camera, was elected as the Green Member of Parliament for Nanaimo Ladysmith on Monday night. Jim says Eva makes him tick. Eva says Jim makes her laugh. They both say that they make each other mad. They clearly work in a kind of social justice and faith symbiosis that can only come from God. I'd like to ask the principal of UTC, Maylan Mabey, and Eva and Jim Manly to join us. Principal Mabey, in recognition of their lifelong faith and work for justice and for their shared visionary ministry, I commend to you Eva and Jim Manly, that you might confer upon them the degree of Doctor of Divinity, honoris causa.